Hi, this is Tom Needham, and you're listening to The Sounds of Film. And I'm so excited to have on the phone with me today a true legend. I'm talking about Peter Singer. He's a moral philosopher. He's a professor of bioethics at Princeton University and the University of Melbourne. He's probably most well known for his book, Animal Liberation. Through the years, he's appeared in a number of documentaries and TV series, including Live and Let Live, Empathy, The Examined Life, Animal People, The Humane Movement in America, Lake of Fire, and A Delicate Balance, The Truth. Today we're going to be talking about two recent books that he put out, including Ethics in the Real World, 82 brief essays on things that matter, and also Marx, A Very Short Introduction. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on The Sounds of Film.
I'm happy to be with you.
Oh man, Peter, so much that I want to talk to you about. You are a well-known atheist who is known for your ethical viewpoints. How, through the years, did you develop your own personal morality through the years?
Well, I suppose it's, in terms of a philosophical view on morality, that started off when I was an undergraduate, and I had a professor who was teaching ethics who was very much opposed to the view that I now hold, which is a utilitarian view, that is the view that we ought to do the acts that will have the best consequences for everybody or for all sentient beings affected by our acts. And as I say, he was opposed to that, and he put up arguments against it, which even as an undergraduate I thought were not really convincing. And so I wrote some essays arguing why they were not convincing, and as indeed a university professor should be, he was fan-minded enough to recognize that I'd put up some good arguments, even if I didn't quite convince him, and encouraged me to go further in philosophy and develop that. So that's what I was doing, and I was then a graduate student at Oxford. This was in the early 70s, and there were a lot of things happening there in philosophy. There was a bit of a shift towards a more practical kind of approach to ethics, to looking at real problems rather than more abstract analysis as it happened in previous years. So I looked at issues like, what do people who are comfortably off, what do they have any obligations or duties to people in extreme poverty in developing countries? And I also started to get interested in questions about our relations with animals, and are we really justified in thinking of animals just as things that we can use for food or fur or to experiment on. So that's what got me going in ethics and set me up in the direction that I guess I've gone since.
You have said multiple times that when people question the existence of God, for you, the thing that troubles you about the belief in God is that God is supposed to be all-knowing, all-powerful, all-caring, and yet there's so much suffering in the world. Can you expand on this idea just a little bit?
Yes. I mean, this is not an argument against any conceivable God, but it is an argument against the God as normally understood by Christians. That is, that, as you say, the God is supposed to be all-powerful, has created the world and can change the world. No limits to God's powers. Secondly, God is supposed to be omniscient, so God knows everything about the world and the way it is, and could foresee the way it was going to develop when God supposedly created the world. And thirdly, God is good. Now, I just cannot imagine how a being with those powers and with that disposition to be good could have created a world which has so much suffering, and let me say, so much completely undeserved suffering and so much pointless suffering. And, some people will say, well, suffering is a result of our sins and failing to obey God, but obviously there are tiny babies who suffer, who are born with horrible diseases and conditions that cause them pain, and then they die after a few months, and they can't possibly deserve to suffer. And Their suffering seems completely pointless, and there are non-human animals who suffer, and again, they're not capable of sinning, and they suffer because, let's say, there's a drought. Here I am in Australia. It's a country which has prone to frequent severe droughts. So when that happens, you will find kangaroos and lots of other animals dying of thirst or hunger because there's nothing left for them to drink or eat. I can't imagine how an all-good, all-powerful, all-knowing God would allow such things to happen.
Well, one of the reasons I'm kind of touching on this subject is because there's been a wave of popularity in terms of atheism here in America and around the world recently, as well as an interest in ethics. And for some of us, it's just a little bit difficult to understand if there is no connection to religion, how does one find an absolute moral system to believe in? And I know you have answers for that. You recently had a memorable appearance on Sam Harris's podcast here in America, and Sam Harris also had as a guest most recently Jordan Peterson, who I think just was over in Australia doing a tour. They have been debating each other, and one of the differences of opinion that seems to exist between the two, and I don't know if I have this exactly right, is that Jordan Peterson, who seems to be very popular right now, seems to be making the claim that when atheists try to separate themselves from any organized religion and claim that they're coming up with their own system of moral beliefs, that in essence that can't be done because we're all just products of ages of societies that were basically indoctrinated with Judeo-Christian values. Sam Harris doesn't agree with this. He thinks he can find morality, I believe, in science. I was wondering, where do you come down in this debate that these two seem to be having in a very public forum recently?
Yeah, I don't actually agree with either of the positions that you just described. I certainly think that there are independent ethical views that are, in fact, prior to religious belief, and you can find views like those that I hold not only in Judeo-Christian society, but you can find Chinese philosophers, for example, going back 2,500 years before Christianity, and certainly with no contact with Judaism, who equally think that we ought to do the acts that have the best consequences. Chinese philosopher called Mozi is the one I'm particularly thinking of. So I don't think you can argue that these views come from particular religious beliefs. On the other hand, I don't agree with Sam Harris that you can derive ethics out of science. That's a mistake that I think philosophers have exposed over quite some time now. I think that, though, that there are, if you like, ethical truths that are neither derived from science nor from religion, but perhaps more like mathematical truths that are self-evident. That, for example, it's self-evident that the well-being of every individual matters, and that similar amounts of pain and suffering are bad, whether it happens to you or to me or to somebody of a different nationality or different ethnicity or religion, or for that matter, even if it happens to a non-human animal, that pain and suffering are bad things, that happiness and well-being are good things. So some of those things seem to me to be issues that once we reach a certain level of awareness and sophistication, we can understand that these things should be taken as axioms of ethics.
Why do we want everyone to be happy? Why should I care about whether someone on the other side of the world is happy?
Right, so you should care because as a rational being you should be able to see that just as your pain or suffering matters to you and your happiness is something that you want for yourself, so other beings are similar to you and that pain for them is similar to what pain is for you. And if it's a bad thing for you, then it's also a bad thing for them. So it's not just a matter of your wants. Of course, I understand that you may want your own pain to stop more than you may want someone else's pain to stop. But if you are prepared to look at this in a more detached and, I would say, a more rational way, then you can see that someone else's pain matters just as your pain matters.
Yeah. Well, you talked about before the idea of how not only should we care about other people, but that perhaps we should be making decisions in our lives in terms of how we spend our money, choices that we make in our life in terms of how we live our lives, because there are consequences to all these different things, and that when we make various choices, people's happiness, it's impacted around the world. Is this the philosophy that we really have to become more familiar with in terms of how everything that we do impacts others?
I think we do. I think we live in a more globalized world now, and we understand the connections between us and others and the impact we can have on them. I suppose the clearest example, which previous generations could not have known about, is that we understand now that simply by burning fossil fuels or by eating meat and raising animals who release methane, we're having an effect on the climate of the entire planet, and that's going to have, and is already having, in fact, very serious consequences for large numbers of people. So it's one way in which we're globally connected, and I think we need to think more about the consequences of what we're doing. But also, of course, the fact that we can now instantly learn of something that's going on elsewhere in the world. I guess right at the moment, people are looking at the situation of the boys in the cave in Thailand, and they're seeing what's happening there, and we get instant information as to whether boys are rescued or not. But of course, on a larger scale, that can happen with people dying in a famine, and we have the capacity to assist. So again, we have obligations that are more far-reaching than they were a couple of hundred years ago, when we couldn't really know about a famine until it was probably too late to do anything about it.
It's funny that you mentioned the boys in the cave. When I was watching that story, I was thinking of you because I've heard you speak a lot about the idea that when you've taken a look at different studies that have been done in terms of how people will respond to help people or not help people, it's very interesting. People tend to not really care much about people when there's a distance between them. I think you've talked about. However, as soon as you start to learn personal details about some person suffering far away, then more people seem to care. And I guess this story of the boys in a cave is an example of that, right?
Exactly. It's a very good example because, especially now that the divers have got there and taken video, we can actually see the boys, we can see their faces, and of course even beforehand we could see their parents worrying about them and telling us about them. So we had a group of identifiable individuals who we could worry about, and all the research shows that we're much more likely to worry about identifiable individuals and relate to them than if somebody just gives us a statistic and says there are 100,000 people in danger of starvation because of the rains failing in a certain part of the world. But if we don't know any details about any of those 100,000 people, we're likely to do less for them than we would do for one person, or in this case a dozen people, where we do have identifying details, where we can see photos of them. That's the way we're wired, I guess. But I think that's unfortunate. And when I was talking before about being able to take a more rational approach to ethics, I think rationally we can see that whether we can see the face of a person doesn't really have much to do with how important it is to help that person.
You've talked also about a very famous case, I think it was in China, but correct me if I'm wrong, about a child who was hit by a car, and then people were just driving by and not helping the victim. And there's been lots of different cases like this through the years. And then there's also lots of stories of people who will heroically sacrifice their own lives just to save a stranger. In all your research that you've done and all your writing about ethics, have you come to any kind of conclusion in terms of, is man basically good or bad? And if so, what does that even mean?
Yes, the incident that you referred to was in China, in the city of Foshan, and what makes it even more shocking is that people weren't driving past the child, they were walking past, or in some cases cycling past the child, quite slowly, and as it so happened, there were video cameras on the street, and so they filmed them, and clearly they had seen the child and were just looking away. They didn't want to get involved, and as a result of that, the child died. So, yeah, quite tragic. I think what the conclusion that I've come to is that we have the capacity to be good under some circumstances, and we have the capacity to be very bad under others. And I think, those of us who feel that we are ethical people and we act well, we're probably fortunate that we've, been living in societies where that's been easier for us, and if we'd been brought up in other circumstances, we might be quite different. So, although I'm not going to say that human nature is entirely flexible, I do think that there are elements of human nature that are affected by the circumstances in which we live. We do have tendencies to be self-interested and to think about the interests of ourselves and our close family, and I think that's an innate tendency that is part of the fact that in order to survive, our ancestors had to have those capacities in order to survive and reproduce, of course. But we do also have the ability to be altruistic, and that's, I think, demonstrable beyond any doubt when we look at what people have done. So there may be differences in individual personalities, but I think it's very important about the way we're brought up and the circumstances we find ourselves in.
I recently had someone on the program who was from the Ayn Rand Institute and talking about the philosophy of Ayn Rand and selfishness. And they were making the case, or he was making the case, that that when people act based on their selfish interests, that number one, that's more natural for people to do. I don't know if you would agree with that completely, but also that indirectly, that when you have many people looking out for their own self-interest, society benefits, and people are better off. And again, they make the case, and I don't know if it's a correct case, that like in industrialized nations, like wherever they employ capitalism, and people are able to pursue profit, the products and the medicine and all the different things that are produced basically trickle down to people, and that eventually the incomes of people improve and the living standards improve. And I don't know if this is all accurate, but this is the case that I hear a lot of people making. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think as far as capitalism is concerned, it is a highly productive system. It does stimulate people to work hard and produce more. But I wonder whether you asked this person from the Ayn Rand Institute about climate change, because it seems to me that that's a very clear example where everybody pursuing their self-interest is going to lead to disaster for everyone.
Yeah.
Because clearly it's in our self-interest to continue to enjoy a very comfortable lifestyle, to use the cheapest forms of energy that we can, which at the moment will still mean coal, if we enjoy meat, to eat meat, which will mean more methane in the atmosphere. And the result of that, I think, is going to be bad for everyone, but particularly bad for the poorest people living in parts of the world that are already tropical and hot and where rains are uncertain. So I think it's, this is of course a well-known type of situation known as the tragedy of the commons, where self-interest does lead to disaster for all. So I think that Randians really need to admit that you can't just allow unregulated self-interest, that you have to put limits on that in various circumstances, and because of climate change, that's the biggest problem. Now, as I say, some people who hold this ethical view will simply deny the facts about climate change because they don't want to face the facts that basically their underlying philosophy doesn't work anymore in a world where climate change exists. But if they're prepared to look at the overwhelming consensus of scientists that say that we are causing climate change and it is going to be disastrous in the long run, then I think they have to abandon that view.
Yeah. We're talking to Peter Singer. He's the author of Ethics in the Real World, 82 Brief Essays on Things That Matter. I love this book. It's a nice, easy read, and it mentions so many different topics that are fun to get into debates with people about. I just want to touch on a couple of just topics that you've dealt with through the years. Eugenics is one of them. Eugenics is a word that a lot of people in America are just learning about because there's been a couple of books that have come out revealing the history of eugenics in America. Some people didn't even know about this. I'm sure you're very well aware of it. That in the early 1900s and beyond, that there was a eugenics program in America, and supposedly even Hitler studied our program and then expanded it in a very disturbing way. But you've written a lot on this topic, and can you talk to our listeners a little bit about some of your thoughts on the subject of eugenics?
Yeah, eugenics, of course, does have a very bad name, and in large part because of the way the Nazis took it and used it for the state to decide that some people were unworthy of existence and a kind of a blot or a flaw on the purity of the supposedly Aryan race. But people nowadays will label things as eugenics that I think are quite different from that, and that are perhaps giving parents or pregnant women choices that I think they ought to have about the kinds of children they bring into the world. And to some extent, that's now increasingly accepted. So, except for people who are opposed to abortion in itself, it's generally accepted that if you are pregnant, you can have some tests done, particularly if you're at higher than normal risk of having a child with some kind of genetic or other abnormality, and that if the tests are positive, then you have the option of terminating the pregnancy and perhaps trying again to have a child who will not have that condition. And we're starting to move beyond that as well in terms of using in vitro fertilization to get a couple to produce multiple embryos and then test those embryos at a very early stage before they're implanted and select the embryos that don't have the abnormality, which is another form of selection that avoids abortion. And probably pretty soon we're going to get to a stage where we can actually select for positive qualities. And that's going to be controversial, and I think we need to start thinking about that now. Do we want to allow couples to select, for example, for embryos who will develop into children who will have better than average chances of getting into elite universities? That's one thing that people would be likely to do. And if we think that that's okay, that people ought to be allowed to do that, then are we going to face a society where rich people can afford to do that and poor people can't? Or should we actually even subsidize the service so that everybody, irrespective of their income, has the ability to have the smartest children that they're capable of having?
This is really the big thing.
I think we'll face those questions, within the next decade or two.
Yeah, I agree with you. This is huge. Where do you think this is all heading? I mean, do you think that this is a great danger, that that rich people will be able to genetically engineer superior children, and that everyone else will be left behind, or is this perfectly okay if that's the way that it is?
I don't think it's okay that we would end up with a stratified society in which, obviously we already have a society that's stratified one to the other. So I would not like to see that. I'm not in principle opposed to the idea of people having the best children that they can, the children who both will be happy in themselves and will be able to make the greatest possible contributions to society and to solving the various problems that the world faces. But I am opposed to only wealthy people being able to do that. So if we do get those techniques, and if we do decide to allow them for some, then I think we ought to make them available to all.
You've also been pretty outspoken about euthanasia, and it seems to me when you read the news that one country after another is starting to ease the rules on euthanasia. There's been much written about how so much of the expense associated with healthcare is really about people in their final year, and you start to hear people make the case that maybe people don't want to go through those last treatments in some cases if there's just tremendous pain and not a lot of promise of much life afterwards. But then there's also people that claim that there's a danger in allowing euthanasia because maybe some people will be discouraged from seeking treatments that maybe could prolong their life. I mean, there's a million issues associated with this. In general, though, what can you tell me right now? Where's your mind at in terms of euthanasia?
Well, I think that where we're talking about competent adults who are aware of their situation, I think that they ought to have that option. It's up to them, Clearly, you might say, well, if they might choose to die, and maybe they could have been cured in some way, but they should be informed about that. They should be informed about the likelihood that will happen and about what the options are, and then I think we should leave that choice up to them, so that if they think, look, the chances that I will live more than a few weeks or a couple of months are very small, and to me, given how bad the quality of my life is right now, I don't think it's worth going on just for that very small chance. Then I think that's a choice that they're entitled to make. And on the other hand, of course, if they do want to go on, then we should try to provide them with the best opportunity for treatment so that they can survive.
There is, in your book, an interesting little essay about the possibility that we're not only going to be talking about people ending their lives earlier, but that perhaps maybe a different issue that we're going to be dealing with is that people might live for 1,000 years or maybe even forever as science develops. Do you think that is where we're heading, and is this a good thing?
Well, we may be heading there in the long run, but there hasn't been really very dramatic progress in that direction. Not towards the goals that you're talking about. Yes, people are living somewhat longer. Maybe more people now can expect to live to 100 than could 20 or 30 years ago. But in terms of getting really beyond that and slowing aging, which is one of the things that people talked about, we haven't made any dramatic breakthroughs. I can remember having conversations about that prospect a decade or more ago, and people, some of the people I was talking to were very hopeful about big breakthroughs, but they haven't really eventuated. So I think we can extend lifespan somewhat, but I don't expect to overcome aging entirely within any short-term future. I think, clearly most people would like to live longer if they could do so in good health and vitality and good quality of life, and that would be a good thing. On the whole, of course, we do have to think about the sustainability of our planet, and we have to think about the number of children being born as well as part of that equation. But if we can reduce fertility rates enough so that the planet still remains sustainable, then I think it would be good if people could live longer. But as I say, I don't really see dramatic breakthroughs coming in the short term.
And Peter, if I could ask you one last question. You also have a book out, Marks a Very Short Introduction. We've been talking about ethics somewhat, And I was wondering, in your study of Marx and your study of ethics in general, have you come to any kind of personal conclusions in terms of, is a society ethically more responsible in providing an environment that's based on the principles of communism or capitalism?
Well, we haven't found a form of communism that works, basically. Communism is a nice idea, the idea that everybody is equal and everybody works cooperatively, that we don't have some people trying to increase their own wealth at the expense of others. They're all wonderful ideals, but they haven't, there's nowhere really where they've been put into practice and they've worked. Clearly not the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc, and not Cuba, and not really China. China has abandoned communism in economic terms, I would say, even if it still is ruled by a party that calls itself a communist party. And even the smaller voluntary experiments like the kibbutz movement in Israel has largely moved away from collective ownership, and kibbutzim now employ outside labor, so they're also, in a sense, becoming employers in a capitalist model. If we're talking about economic and social systems, we need to find systems that work, that suit human nature as it is, rather than as we might ideally wish it to be. And unfortunately, communism doesn't seem to suit that. Now that's not to say that capitalism is a perfect system either. I think it has many flaws and problems, and clearly the fact that it leaves some people in pretty extreme poverty is a major problem. So I think we can modify and soften capitalism, and some of the European societies with their more comprehensive social security and safety nets have been able to do that, and probably that's about the best we can do at present in terms of the social institutions that we have, that are societies that are still capitalist, but as I say, that provide more security for all, so that we don't have extremes of poverty alongside extremes of wealth.
We've been speaking to Peter Singer. He's the author of Ethics in the Real World, 82 Brief Essays on Things That Matter, and Marx, A Very Short Introduction. I want to recommend both of these books to our listeners. Peter, thank you so much for joining us tonight on The Sounds of Film.
Thank you, Tom. It's been good talking with you.
Okay, take it easy. Good night.
Good night. Bye.